Hi everybody. So today what I'd like to talk about is a technique related to setting and maintaining high academic standards. So we know that high expectations are one of the most reliable drivers of high academic achievement as well as achievement beyond the classroom. And so today's technique is going to focus on one specific aspect of academic expectation. And that is that when you ask a question in the classroom and call on a student, and that student doesn't know the answer, we need to set up the expectation that they will push through and do the work that's required in order to learn what it was that they did not know. So we need to make sure that students learn that although not knowing something is okay, trying and working is absolutely essential and required, and that this work will in fact lead to knowledge, learning, and growth. So the key thing here is that if a student doesn't know the answer, gives an incorrect answer, or if a student just says, I don't know, or I don't remember, or I didn't do the reading, or any of those types of responses, that is not going to be accepted as a reason for you as a faculty member to move on to another student and let that original student avoid answering the questions. And so we need a technique for accomplishing that, and that technique is called no opt-out. So the key principle that's underlying this technique of no opt-out is that any sequence that begins with a student either unwilling or unable to answer a question correctly should end with the student providing the correct answer. So that's the key principle there. Now, why is this important? Well, if you skip a student who says, I don't know, or I don't remember, or, I'm not prepared, can you, sometimes students will just say, I'll pass, right? So if you let a student do that and you skip that student, you've created an incentive for other students in the class to copy this behavior, and the risk is that you'll watch I don't know spread like the plague throughout your classroom. And so we need a technique that can keep this from happening. So here's the basic sequence for no opt-out. It starts with you asking a question that the student fails to respond to. What you do after that is really important. So the key thing at this point is you don't just say okay and go on to another student. You inform the student that you will get back to them and you will expect them to answer the question. Then the next step is you call on another student to answer the question. Then you return to the original student and ask them to give the correct answer. So this would look something like, you call on a student and they're like, I don't know. And they say, okay, so listen, I'm going to call on somebody else. I want you to pay careful attention to what they say because I'm going to get back to you and I'm going to ask you to provide the answer. And I may ask you some follow-up questions about it as well. So you've notified that student that they will be expected to give the answer. Then you go on and you would call on another student, then they'll give an answer, and then you go back to the original student. Now, there's a couple points about this sequence. The first one is, it's the key thing that is getting accomplished here is it does end with the student providing the correct answer. Okay, so when you do that, the student learns that they're going to have to work anyway. They're not just going to get a free pass, and so there's an incentive there for them to think that, hey, the next time I get called on, it might be worth it for me to actually put the effort into answering. The second thing is that you're demonstrating to everyone that everybody's learning matters, that, just saying that I don't know is not a pass to go on to someone else, and you don't get neglected just because you can't think of an answer or you're not prepared, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I recognize that you might be thinking to yourself, hey, a lazy student might still be glad to just get the answer from another student and then repeat it. So I want to talk about that as well. There are ways and variations of doing this technique that can get around that problem. And there are other ways that actually make it even easier for the student. And you have to think about, there'll be some stuff that you have to think about situationally, like what is the best approach. Some of those will be time constraints that might drive you to use something like this where you just go to the next student or something like that. And there are other things where you might want to dig in deeper. So let's talk a little bit about some of those variations. So first variation is a very, very basic one that's even faster than and more simple for the student than calling on a different student. And that's one where you supply the correct answer and then you ask the student to repeat it. Okay. Now, this is can be less than ideal in terms of cognition and work on the part of the students, but it's sometimes unavoidable because it's fast and you will have to balance time demands. And even that additional work is something at least the student is going through having to answer that, and there may be something that sticks in their head from that. Okay. Next variation is you provide a cue, not the answer, but just a cue, and the student uses it to figure out the correct answer. Now, these can be quite good because they require the student to do some hard thinking based on whatever cue that you give them. Now, but figuring out where the student is at and what cue they need that they're going to need in order to put the pieces together might require some skill and some attention, but this is a very good technique because it does stimulate the type of thinking that you want the students to do. So the next variation involves you directing another student to provide a cue and then having the original student use that information in the cue to figure out the correct answer. Now, this can be even better from the point of view of stimulating student cognition because it's not only the original student who's having to do the hard thinking, but it's the other students who will have to do the hard thinking. And you can boost ratio in this way by saying something like, all right, I'm going to ask somebody to give, so-and-so, this original student, some information or a cue so that they can answer the question. So start thinking of a cue that might help him or her, right? And when you do that, suddenly a lot of students now have to think about not just the question that you ask, but what kind of information might be useful for another student around that question, and that's going to be stimulating their cognition. But remember, this is can be a complex balancing act because you could spend a lot of time going through this, and of course, time is something that we have to manage carefully in the classroom. Okay. So I want to talk about what constitutes a cue. Okay, so a cue is different from a hint because they're grounded in course relevant material, and so they generate better learning, or they're more effective at organizing the knowledge in the student's mind. Whereas a hint can just be anything that gets a student to be able to answer the question, right? So, for example, let's say I asked the students, hey, what type of organizational structure would an employee, in what type of organizational structure would an employee report to both a functional manager and a divisional manager, right? So if that were the question, a hint could be something as totally useless or unuseful as somebody saying, or a student saying, or you saying, well, it starts with the letter M, right? Or, something like, well, Keanu Reeves and Lawrence Fishburne were in a popular sci-fi action movie that had this name, right? So then it's like, okay, then if they say Matrix, they get the answer, but that doesn't really help them learn anything in the process. So ideally, you're trying to give them cues that force some cognition. All right, and so some principles around this. The first one is, ideally, again, given unlimited time, you want to provide the smallest possible cue to force greater student thinking. All right, but in order to make it work, ideally you would have a sort of repertoire of cues that you can draw on so that you can implement them really quickly and toss them out. So, for example, one potential cue could be something as simple as directing the students about where the material can be found, either in their textbooks or the notes or something that you've talked about. So it could be something like, hey, the table listing the different types of organizational structures is on page 321, right? And then, you'd have to give the students some time to go through the textbook and get 321, but then they'd see the information there. Now, they're just getting the information, but, they have to look at the different types. That's going to bring the stuff back to their memory, and then they have to sort of sort through them and remember which one has the two different, reporting to two different people, and then pick the right one. Okay, so that's one potential type of cue, telling them where the material can be found. Another type of cue is saying, like, directing the student to the part of the question that they should focus on in order to think about it carefully. So I might say something like, well, think again about an employee who's reporting to two different people, right? So I'm telling them, like, that's kind of the critical piece of information in the question. And so that cues them for what to think about. I might also do something like provide another name for a term or terms that are in the question, or I might give them examples of that term for a term that I think might be stumping the student. So I could do something like, hey, let's say we're talking about an employee who does marketing at Garmin and has one boss who's a marketing manager, and then the other boss is the VivoFit product manager, right? So I'm sort of making sure that they understand what a functional manager is versus a product or divisional manager is. Okay, so that might jog their memory. Another cue could be giving them other examples of the thing that you're asking about. So if you're asking about a certain thing and the students are like hazy on what it means, you can provide some examples to clarify the idea that they'd have about what it is that, that term means. Or you could just ask the students themselves to identify the part of the question that they're struggling with. Because sometimes you'll ask a question and the students, they kind of understand it, but there's some terms in there they don't get, or there's some concepts they don't get. And if you ask them to identify that themselves, then the students can sort of help guide you on what it is that they're missing. And if they have the ability to sort of identify what they're missing, that's actually a useful skill for them to have. So ideally, all the students should know that they always have the option to ask you a question that might help them figure out the answer to the question that you've asked them. So in a sense, you give them this option of sort of picking their own cue. And when the students know that and they're comfortable asking you, that's actually a good thing because you get them to think about their own thinking and the knowledge that they have and they don't have. So that's another type of cue that you can use. Okay, just a little bit more about different forms of cueing. So another very, very simple cue can be if a student gives an answer that's incorrect, then just repeating the student's answer back to them. A lot of times when they hear the answer from someone else, they're actually able to recognize the error that they've made and then correct it. Okay, so that's a useful form of cueing when you've got a student who's given an incorrect answer. Another thing you might do is, if the question that you've asked them is grounded in something where it's a process or it's a rule or there's a definition that you've discussed in the past, then just providing the rule or giving them a definition that's not the definition that just, again, if the question is just directly answering them for the definition of something, you wouldn't want to use this. But if it's a question that's a little more complicated than that, and it's just like you're not sure they understand the definition of one of the foundational pieces to answering that question, providing that a relevant definition can allow them to go, oh, it's this thing, and then they can sort of answer that question. Okay, so that's another type of cue. And then another thing that you could do is if you've got something that involves it's a step-by-step process, or a way of working out a problem, or sort of an ordered sequence of how to think through something, you can just point out the first step. And that could cue them with, oh, that's right, this is part of this thing, and these are these steps, and then they can kind of work through the steps and answer the question. Or it doesn't have to be the first step. It might be whatever the next step is, or the step that they're stuck at, or something like that. And that can be helpful as well. The other thing that you can do is you can eliminate some obvious or non-obvious incorrect choices. So if you've asked them a question and there's, 3 or 4 or 5 different ways that they could answer it, and some of those are clearly wrong, you might say, well, we know that it's not such and such. So in this example of the organizational structure, you could say something like, well, we see here that this person has a functional manager, so it can't just be a divisional structure, right? So that's the type of thing that you can do there. All right, and so just some final notes on final thoughts on no opt-out. Key point, don't forget the return. All right, so this is something that can happen quite easily. It's very easy to lose track. If you go on to another student to supply the answer, it's very easy to sort of, okay, that student answer the question and forget that you told another student you were going to get back to them and then go on to a different question. So you do want to remember to do the return. Second thing is tone can be really important when you're using no opt-out. And so you want to try to keep your tone warm and supportive, because what you're doing is you're forcing a reluctant student to push through discomfort. And so keeping track of your tone can really make a difference here in terms of encouraging the student to work through it. All right. Another thing is, if you have a cue that has made the question much too easy for the student, so whatever your cue was too simple, or you've just given the answer, or you've had another student give the answer, you might want to give the student a follow-up question so that they are still engaged in doing cognition. And so we'll learn more about follow-up questions in a future video when we talk about the technique that's called Stretch It. But that'll be for another video. So anyway, I hope this has been useful, and thank you very much.